This is our Enterprise Watch segment. Thank you so much for staying with us. There were programs that were rather funded by PEPFAR in the entrepreneurial sector, which now have their funding in limbo as non-health and life savings projects has been stopped. Business journalist Nelson Ndangamandla had a sit-down with the executive director of the Coordinating Assembly of the non-governmental organizations known as Kango. His name is Thembinkosi Dlamini, and he gave details of the situation on the ground, as well as the economic impact of the withdrawal of funding for some programs, especially for enterprises. Now, Nelly, before we get into the conversation, I mean, we saw a backdrop on our news segment. Inati Dlamini, Chief Executive Officer of Business Eswatini, saying it is a steep situation that we're in right now. He called it a precipitous situation. The conversation that you had with Mr. Dlamini, is it along the same sentiments?
It is along the same sentiments as Fiso and the viewer at home. He is saying that this is going to have a hard-hitting impact on the economy. We just wanted to really understand what is really going on, what is the situation on the ground, and what should we be ready for. What is going to happen to them in terms of the loans they have taken. We've spoken to Bankers Association, and they said each bank is going to handle a matter as it arises. So we wanted to really understand, as Kango is home to over 90 non-governmental organizations. Yes, governmental organizations. So we just wanted to understand what is it that is really happening, because there has been a lot of noise around the PEPFAR funding.
What is it that is really happening? Let's just take a listen and indeed hear what it is really that is happening.
Let me first explain that in terms of the U.S. funding, there is U.S. embassy funding, there is U.S. aid funding, and there is PEPFAR funding. So it's different streams, different objectives, but the bulk of the funding was the PEPFAR funding, which was the one that we were utilizing for the HIV/AIDS response in the country. So at the end of January, the executive orders were issued, obviously, which were simply saying there's going to be a review in the period of 90 days, and then all implementing agencies were supposed to not continue implementing any U.S.-funded projects, be they PEPFAR projects, USAID projects, or even U.S. embassy projects. Now, what subsequently happened then, there was an application by, in particular, UNAIDS to Marco Rubio, the U.S. Department of State Secretary, who then issued a waiver. The waiver simply said that certain activities, especially those that were delivering key health services to vulnerable populations, life-saving activities, health-related activities, were supposed to continue. However, other activities were still subject to the 90 days stop work order as it is. Subsequent to that, in the last week, we started receiving termination notices. The termination notices, what they mean is that the U.S. has finished their review, and they have taken a position that that particular project was not aligned with the U.S. foreign aid policy that is going to be there under the MAGA regime. So now what is outstanding in terms of those particular grants is that there's supposed to be a process of winding up. Obviously deciding what happens to the assets of the projects. You know, there's so many, say maybe cars, computers, desks that were bought via those projects, that there needs to be a decision how to dispose of those. There is also need to be a decision around the human resource, because once the grants were terminated, the staff were also put on suspension, whereby they were supposed to sit at home and not come to work or carry out any activity. So now the difference between the suspension notice stop work order and the termination is that now, with those particular staff that were 100% attached to the PEPFAR funded projects, as an example, we need to start the process of producing termination letters as well, because there is unlikely going to be jobs for them going forward. But the way that it works in our scenario, you find that PEPFAR funding is running alongside other sources of funds like the Global Fund or Frontline Aids or other donors. This then gives us the element of shared costs, whereby you'd find that there was one staff member who was 40% PEPFAR funded, 60% funded by another donor. Now, there is a problem with regards to those people, which means other than just the impact on the PEPFAR funded projects and activities, there is likely going to be impact in other donor funded projects as well, because sometimes if the contribution by PEPFAR was 60% of a particular staff member, that staff member might decide to say, no, I'm not going to work for 40% of my time or the money, and decide to quit. It is within their rights to do so. And then there's also office space, whereby our organization were entering into long-term leases with certain premises with the understanding that they are funded under PEPFAR. Sometimes the rents were paid directly from the PEPFAR funds. Sometimes they were partially paid by PEPFAR. So some of those organizations are now sitting with offices that they do not know what to do with the office space, because the PEPFAR staff is no longer there, and they are in a challenging situation because of the need to find the money to pay for that space that they were utilizing, whilst at the same time trying to serve notices. For instance, you know that with lease agreements, sometimes there's a notice period of maybe a year or 3 months, whichever the case may be. Of course, some of our organization had a fleet of cars, PEPFAR-funded cars. Most of the cars, the instruction is that you park those cars. You are not supposed to use those cars because they are PEPFAR cars until a determination is made about what to do with those cars. Maybe they are going to be sold, which means downstream, those companies that were servicing the cars or fueling the cars, or the people who were driving the cars, are now affected in terms of their business activities. So there's a lot of impact downstream of the funding cuts than simply these are the NGOs that are affected. You know, when it comes to commodities, your PrEP, your condoms, your ARVs, and other such commodities as reagents that are used in the labs, most of these commodities were purchased through PEPFAR funds. So those companies that were supplying the NGOs and also government departments and laboratories of those commodities, you will find that they will have a challenge in terms of sustaining their operations without this funding.
He says the situation is quite steep downstream. It's a lot that has been affected, but the conversation didn't end then. And this is where we get to appreciate what Market View does and the job that you do, of course, because to a lot of people at home, they think it was just maybe 2 hospitals that were affected and maybe some of the patients and, you know, the employees there, but it's quite deep.
Yes, so on the show we look mainly at the economic side of things. So we wanted to know what is happening on the entrepreneurship side, what is going to happen in terms of the impact on the economy. So he also gave us a clear explanation what was happening. But I want to make it clear that he did mention that the life-saving projects were not stopped, like your ARVs and everything. He made that clear, yeah.
But still, you know, we can make an argument. We always say that small businesses are quite essential in our economy.
True.
So they are affected, and he chimes in. Let's listen.
We wouldn't know exactly which businesses or which particular projects have been stopped at this point, because you will remember that the termination notices are given to each organization as the review is being finished of that particular project. So we do know that most of the life-saving projects, health-related projects, maybe they've not received the termination notices. But those projects that are non-life-saving, non-health-related, because remember the US government was also supporting entrepreneurship projects, women empowerment projects, fighting gender-based violence projects, and also projects promoting human rights and governance. So some of those kinds of projects have been terminated, which means that in instances where, for instance, the US was helping an entrepreneur to source certain machinery for their business enterprise, you might find that that particular business enterprise will no longer benefit from that machinery. However, the nature of the project is that sometimes the project is partially grant funded and then partially loan, which means is a local bank that comes with the counterpart funding. So some entrepreneurs have been saying that we have the counterpart funding already sitting in our accounts, but we're no longer having now the grant for us to be able to purchase the whole machinery that we need for our businesses, which means certain business people might now have to incur interest and repayment obligations under conditions whereby they were not able to actually procure the equipment that they wanted. So we think that the impact overall on the economy will be huge. If you understand that the US aid funding overall, including PEPFAR, was in excess of 1.3 billion emalangeni per annum. And we do know that the US aid funding, including PEPFAR, was one of our most stable sources of external funding over the past so many years. What we've seen is that since 2020, there has been a reduction in other sources of funding, but the PEPFAR USAID funding was more stable, almost being reduced at most 10% per annum, whilst the other sources of funding took a nosedive. The reason why this was the case was because of the challenges that we see globally. For instance, the wars between Russia and Ukraine, the issues in Gaza, in DRC and others, but also issues of climate change were taking a toll. So a lot of funding sources, our traditional funding sources, were now being diverted towards those particular causes that are thought about as being worthy to be supported.
24 minutes after 2. We are running out of time, but we still have the market analysis.